Good evening, everybody. Those of you in India, good evening to those in Singapore. Good morning to those in the East Coast United States, and good afternoon to those in Europe. Today's webinar, organized by Nishith Desai Associates, is on the topic of ESG and climate change opportunities for PE investments. Before we start, I would like to introduce the firm of Nishith Desai Associates. Nishith Desai Associates is a research and strategy-driven international firm with offices in Mumbai, Palo Alto, Bangalore, Singapore, New Delhi, Munich, and New York. Its team comprises of specialists who provide strategic advice on legal, regulatory, and tax-related matters in an integrated manner derived from key insights carefully culled from allied industries. Nishith Desai pioneered the field of international taxation and asset management industry. NDA advised Mauritius and more recently conceptualized Gift City financial centers. Nishith Desai Associates is engaged in private equity for over 3 decades and is a thought leader in private equity and legal matters relating to several other areas, including technology. NDA has remained in the forefront of advances in these fields and has been awarded the Asia's Most Innovative Law Firm award by the Financial Times for 4 years in a row. Given NDA's deep involvement in private equity, it provides invaluable insights for the benefits of its clients, the ecosystem, as well as the regulators. Many of these insights are published regularly and can be accessed via NDA's newsletters and special reports available on NDA's website. I would now very briefly introduce our honored guests and NDA's Nishith Desai Associates speakers. We have Mr. Sumit Sen. He's a partner at Actus. Since 1917, he has been involved with Actus's long life infrastructure team responsible for India and Southeast Asia. He worked for 13 years at Goldman Sachs in the principal investment area, focused primarily on energy, infrastructure, TMT, and healthcare. At Goldman Sachs, he led their investment in Renew Power. Turning to our honored guest, Rocky. Rocky is a senior vice president and head of ESG at GEF Capital Partners. Previously, she was with ERM for 13 years, and where she led the taxation practice. The transaction services practice. She has 20 years experience in consulting and private equity. She has experience in sustainability projects in environment, health, and safety. Her core competencies are in the fields of due diligence, liability assessment, and compliance auditing, and environment risk assessment. From Nishith Desai Associates, we have Ratnadeep Roy Chaudhary. He is the leader of NDA's private equity and M&A practice. He has 13 years experience as a commercial lawyer. He has managed multi-layered teams for execution and client acquisitions. He was the general counsel of a private equity fund, supporting investment professionals, ensuring management of legal risk. And today's moderator, I'm going to introduce to you from Nishith Desai Associates, is Sahil Kanuga. He's a leader and in the international dispute resolution and investigations at Nishith Desai Associates. He worked on complex matters, including India and international arbitrations. He aggressively tackles the challenges presented by each case. He has negotiated private equity and joint venture transactions. So at this stage, I will hand over to Sahil. And I would just like to inform everybody that this particular discussion will carry on till 6:30 p.m. IST, and it will then automatically transition into what we call the coffee corner. Everybody in the audience is invited to the coffee corner where you can ask further questions. Over to you, Sahil.
Thank you, Arvind Bhai. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, evening, or even good morning, depending on where in the world you are. Thank you for joining us today. Today's discussion is on ESG and climate change. we are joined by two stalwarts, Sumit Sen and Rakhi Kulkarni, who have very kindly agreed to share their thoughts with us. So thank you to both of you. While ESG is the current buzzword, today's conversation will stir up some reflection on how PE looks at this opportunity. And this is what we're going to delve a little bit on today. For everyone's convenience, I'd like to inform you that we have set aside about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of today's session for question and answers. Should you have any questions, please do put it in the question box and we'll try and address it. Otherwise, please do join us for coffee in the virtual coffee room where we will be able to discuss it further. Now, without further ado, let's dive right in. The first question I'd like to throw to Sumit and Rakhi, and please choose to take it in whatever order you would like. How much of the global fund flow are you seeing directed towards climate change opportunities today?
I can start, Sahil. Thanks a lot. Pleasure being part of this panel. So net zero, ESG, sustainability are all the buzzwords. But the amount of capital, to answer you, is massive, right? So we're talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars of capital, which is kind of committed towards transforming economy for net zero. As far as Actus is concerned, to be honest, we do not see this as a specific ESG mandate, but we just see this as good business practice. And ESG and climate change, right? And we've kind of transformed from calling it ESG to sustainability, because it kind of engulfs all the various aspects of beyond just climate, right? Are integrated into the management of all our funds and all our portfolio companies, because we just think it's good business sense. We're aware that a lot of funds distinguish between climate change focused funds and other funds, but as I mentioned, for us it's all the same, and we think ultimately over a period of time ESG mandates will disappear. And every general partner will just consider sustainability alongside what you call legal, technical, commercial, and other usual aspects that we look into every business.
Rakhi, your thoughts?
Rakhi, you're on mute.
Sorry, apologies. No, thanks, Sal. Pleasure to connect with everyone. No, I completely echo what Sumit just mentioned. I think according to me, 2015 Paris Agreement has been quite a game changer in terms of how the world has started looking at climate-related issues, climate impact. And I think the latest COP26 has only sort of accelerated after, certain countries kind of came and put forth their commitments, net zero goals, all of that. So, I mean, the climate change is real. It's no longer like, just a conversation, just a talk. I mean, there are much more short-term, immediate actions that need to be taken and not long-term goals that perhaps we were thinking maybe a few years back. So it requires definitely a lot of capital flow. South Asia, Asia region, I think, is definitely up there in terms of the whole climate impact radar and businesses will have to start thinking differently, operate differently. And like Sumit rightly mentioned, ESG sustainability has nothing to do with just a mandate or just a way of, I mean, it's going to be a way of doing business irrespective of what sector, what you do. I mean, just to give a little context of GF Capital Partners, the erstwhile Global Environment Fund has been around in looking at investing in these kind of businesses from early 1990s. So there has been a sort of focus to look at businesses that actually contribute to climate impact. The fund that we have here in India focuses on resource efficiency, so on water, wastewater, clean energy, circular economy. I think all of these areas are extremely important, and going forward, I think this will become the way of doing how we do business. So I think climate change opportunities, I think we can keep using different words, ESG, sustainability, climate change, but I think everything is so interrelated, integrated, that we really can't separate one from the other. That's going to be my broad view on that, Sahil.
So just to sort of jump in with some questions, as Sumit, Rakhi, both of you mentioned, there's this huge impetus to allocate capital towards, climate goals, sustainability, etc. Just to get your thoughts on, get your thoughts on some of the sort of reverse pressures that are happening, such as each of these, say, sources of capital countries focusing on their own capacities, sort of trying to move away from fossil fuels and therefore having to create large capacities onshore. That being, sort of one of the opposing, I would say, trends. And the other, obviously, criteria being return on capital that is expected by people who put in. So how are you seeing, those metrics are playing out when capital is being allocated to countries such as India? Is it tending to meet the expectations of the capital providers, or are there challenges around that? We all know the kind of the challenges, say for example, with the discoms are facing. Is there a willingness you are seeing from the ultimate consumer to pay for the climate change, the climate change goals and the cost of pivoting away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, so I think there are many questions, Ratnadeep, in that. But let's just, so in terms of geographies and the geopolitical world that we are living in, obviously it's extremely volatile, right? So I think that's kind of evolving over a period of time, right? But despite everything that you see, I think the one thread that unites all of that is climate change. Because I think that even today, like when you think of issues and debates and discussions happening globally, the most important one is energy, right? And how do we solve this issue around energy across? And if you dive deeper into that question of energy, I think the other question that comes out is gas, right? And I would say gas probably is the biggest debate that people are having globally, because when you look at geographies, as Rakhi highlighted, whether it's Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, India, broader South Asia, all of these are heavily fossil fuel based economies, right? And if you need to move or address any part of our climate change targets that we have, gas needs to be a fundamental transition fuel for us, right? And at least as far as we are concerned at Actus, we call it the smart olive strategy, which is to basically say that's the transition that we would like to support, right, across all of these geographies as we move from today where we are 50, 60, 70% of economies focused on fossil fuel to a place 2050 or 2070, wherever you look at, where probably we are talking about 50, 60% of the economy actually focused on green energy, right? So in terms of geographies, I think there is broader alignment across economies, across larger countries, whether it's developed or developing, to embrace this. And I think my view is that at least economies that where we have gone in, there is more collaboration happening, which actually we never saw that happening in even 2 years back, 3 years back, 5 years back. And I'm talking more about the South Asian countries as well. When you look at Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, some of these countries are actually moving faster and embracing foreign capital to come in and replace their existing technology with something that will help them transition into this, right? But yes, gas is a bigger question. Gas transition is a bigger question, especially in Europe. And we are facing some resistance, from a lot of European LPs, especially, right, who consider gas as black. But I would say that we are trying to work with a broader ecosystem to kind of change that mindset and embrace gas, or for that matter, any other technology which we believe could transition us into green. So that's my first comment on geographies and how that's kind of playing out. I don't know, Rakhi, please add, and then I I can kind of jump into the cost and returns question that you are highlighting probably.
No, I think Ratndeep, so I think energy transition is going to take some time. It's not going to be a sort of a quick process, and there will be, in my sense, a little bit of a hurdle, a little bit of a challenge in moving from there to there. That said, I think it's sort of non-negotiable that we will have to move in that direction. It's a matter of how much time and how quickly are we able to adapt to that. If we look at some of the hard to abate sectors in climate, right? So, for example, steel is there, cement is there, oil and gas companies. I think a lot of these industries, especially the Indian steel industries and the Indian cement industries, have started thinking about what are the alternatives in terms of moving from fossil to, let's say, green hydrogen, for example. So a lot of these now, how possible are these technologies that we can start implementing? Because if we have to move towards green hydrogen, then we have to have a huge renewable capacity also, and that is going to take some time to get there as well. But these are sort of thoughts and thinking and conversations that are happening quite rapidly in the corporate sector here, especially in this hard to abate sectors. So I think we'll have to get there. I think it will take time, and therefore I think you can't look at climate change without looking at the entire transition bit, that the time that will be taken for transition to go from A to B. I think that's going to be something that needs to be factored in.
I think if I understood Ratnadeep, the second question that you raised, right, which is what is the cost of this transition, right? Like how are the end customers responding to this? How are people thinking about this? How are LPs and GPs thinking about it, right? So as far as we are concerned, just to be first to start on that point, we believe in the core philosophy of values drive values, right? Which effectively says that commercial value that we finally achieve is very much linked to some of the core principles that we have in life and values that we have in life, which is then very closely interlinked to the sustainability and ESG aspect, i.e. saying that if we do this right, commercial value will follow. And I think there are studies which are done by the McKinseys of the world and some of the largest consultants of the world, which basically say that if you take care of the community, if you give back to the community in a sustainable way, commercial values actually follow, right? And for us, what is also important, and if you think of just wind and solar and some of these things, practically the places that we operate in, they're so close to community. The fact of the matter is, if you do not take care of them, more likely than not, right? You will have more disruptions in your plant. More likely than not, you will have issues with your maintenance. And I'm just talking about very operational matters, right? And if you have those, clearly that reflects on your commercial value. Effectively saying that they are very interlinked, right? So for us, those two philosophies, which is community sustainability and commercial values, are not different, right? And every investment that we look at across every subsector, right, whether it's energy, infra, digital infra, real estate, I think these values are very closely interlinked. Now, if you look at what has wind and solar, for example, which are the low-hanging fruits, obviously hydrogen will come, storage will come, but these two, which are today front and center of this overall transition, if you look at it, it has actually overall reduced the cost of power, right? So we are talking about 2.5 rupee, 2 rupee tariffs, 2 cents tariffs, which were at some point in time much higher, right? So the grid parity construct that we were talking about a few years back, whether we would actually get to grid parity, the reality is, because of all the innovations that have happened on the supply side and the capital that is chasing, this space, costs have actually come down, right? So effectively, there is a way to argue that wind, solar, and some of the other technologies have actually brought down the cost. Now, can this go down further? Yes. Is it completely non-subsidized in large part of the world? The answer is no. But India today, I think, obviously, a lot of the subsidies have gone. When you're looking at some of the Southeast Asian markets, there is a concept of feed-in tariffs, which arguably are subsidized to some extent. But we see no reason why that will not follow the same course as what India has, right? Which is once the economy is stabilized, people believe in green, the lender community believes in green, then slowly the costs over a period of time come down. Now, what I'll also say is, as we are on the buy side and the sell side on various transactions. It is very clear for us that if you've taken care of E, S, and G issues, you are perceived way more attractive at exit, right? Which effectively then increases your overall value proposition as well, which we are seeing in some of the more recent exits, that we have made, right? Which again, goes back that, if you're following these things more judiciously, it actually adds to your value rather than, takes away from your overall returns and the value proposition that we have. The final comment I'll make is, from a scale standpoint as well, what do investors really care about? One is obviously, building scale and getting returns. So clearly on the returns point, I would say that today between fossil fuels and renewables, there is obviously a huge premium that people attach to renewables versus fossil fuels, right? Which is there, which makes our lives slightly difficult when you are on the buy side of these trades. But because you can build scale, right? Which, if you look at the Indian context, the amount of scale that you can build in the renewable space, you just cannot build that type of scale in any other space, right? And when you have scale, when you have a proper value proposition with customers, given the costs have come down, and if you have an attractive value proposition at the time of exit, and if you bring all of those things together, arguably over a period of time, you're saying that LPs and GPs would actually look at this opportunity more favorably, rather than some of the temporary disruptions may happen, given the competitive tension across renewable assets, especially today, right, is on the higher side versus what happens to fossil fuels.
Rakhi, your 2 bits on that?
No, I think in terms of the returns, right? At GF, we have been integrating ESG across all our investments very, very closely. And we have seen that we always find that there is an upside to kind of, integrating ESG. Where we kind of add value is in terms of improving various ESG practices across all our portfolio companies, be it improvement in labor practices, workplace practices, health and safety, environmental issues, governance at the company level. And Sumit rightly pointed out that at an exit point, your value of the company, because you have integrated ESG, is only going to go up. It also depends a lot in terms of how investors outside or other companies, maybe European companies, Japanese companies, etc. If there is a transaction that is happening, they are going to give a higher weightage to all the ESG aspects that you have kind of considered. And more increasingly, I think there is a much more higher appreciation that we can't really segregate this from the commercial value and the business value. It is very, very closely integrated. So definitely, I think we can't look at ESG as some different entity out there. It has to be clearly integrated with how you do business.
So with that thought in mind, Rakhi, how do PE funds do diligence on ESG or the governance risk? And an offshoot of that question, what kind of covenants do PE funds require of their portfolio companies to prevent ESG or governance failures?
So essentially, there are a lot of international frameworks that are available in terms of how one undertakes an ESG diligence. The most commonly used is something called as the IFC performance standards, wherein there are various different indicators and parameters in terms of how you evaluate a company on various ESG metrics. that can include right from in terms of, do they have an ESG management system, do they have the right talent, what are the various environmental indicators, how do they manage that? And again, it all depends from sector to sector, because every sector is going to come with its own ESG challenges. Some might have a higher ESG footprint than the other. But at GF, we have been very commonly using the IFC performance standards, and increasingly there are other sort of more specialized kind of frameworks that are coming up. Let's say if you have to look at human rights, then you have the United Guiding Principles for Human Rights that is coming up, and we need to start looking at all our potential investment through that lens. You have the International Labour Organization and their conventions coming in, so looking more specifically from that lens to see, are there any kind of violations or any kind of issues that our companies or potential companies would be exposed to. There are the World Bank EHS guidelines, and of course in India you also have the regulatory environmental, social, health, safety standards, which are quite extensive in nature, and you can't really not look at that. Regulatory and compliance is of course primarily there. We have also started looking at all our investments also in terms of the alignment with sustainable development goals. How our companies contribute to the SDGs, and what kind of a meaningful contribution can we further enhance post our investment. What happens after you undertake this diligence in a very comprehensive manner? So for us, it mandatorily involves undertaking a site visit, going and really seeing the site, document review, discussing with management. And our process of ESG diligence really starts and begins when we sort of know who, when we have got through the first stage of initial conversations with the company. The idea is to bring up these conversations right up front with your portfolio, because not all companies perhaps are sort of aware of what exactly ESG requirements could be, because everybody has their own understanding and definition of what ESG is. So from a fund standpoint, it becomes extremely critical for us that we explain to our potential company what our standards of ESG are, what our requirements are, is there an alignment on that, and undertaking a detailed diligence process. Now, coming to your second question, right, in terms of what the covenants are there, I don't think there is a standard covenant that we have to put across in all our agreements. It's very case to case specific, because every time you undertake a diligence, there are going to be different issues. Some will be common issues, some will be sort of very specific issues that will come out. And what we come out is an environmental social action plan. The environmental social action plan kind of becomes the guiding sort of a document for all our portfolio companies to come in, and that typically forms a part of the agreement or covenant or whatever you might say it, and again a strong commitment from our portfolio companies to ensure that it gets followed. I think that's largely the process, which I think is kind of followed across, plus minus here and there. But essentially the idea is to undertake a detailed diligence to make sure that you know exactly where the gaps are. And that's also the point where you know if there are any red flag issues. Are there going to be any business risk interruption issues? Like Sumit mentioned, for example, if you're having a facility or operations in the middle of community, are there sort of, agitations, unrest happening around, which might be a potential threat to your investment going forward? What are the sort of checks and balances that you need to put in place in place to make sure that there are no hindrances to your business? Are there kind of any contamination related issues, any legacy risk related issues with the companies, etc., that you might be knowingly unknowingly taking in? So I think the diligence forms a very, very important element of how you sort of take decisions on the ESG aspects, and therefore what kind of value creation you will bring in as a fund, as an investor, to move the company from, let's say, if they are at number 2, how do you take them to number 6, number 7, or 8 in your investment horizon? I think that's essentially the key.
So before I get Sumit in to give his views on this, what I'm hearing from you is that when you look at a portfolio company and you start having these discussions with them, very often there is a process of education that takes place. And sure enough, I mean, at the end of the day, not everyone is as sophisticated on the ESG metrics as we would like them to be. It's a process. Everyone will go through it. But in light of that, are climate change related measurable metrics becoming necessary for portfolio companies to start tracking?
Very interesting question, Sahil. So very recently, GEF has become a formal supporter to what we call as the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, which is the TCFD. Now, TCFD is a sort of a global framework which requires financial institutions to measure and monitor and understand or take into account the various climate risks that their businesses could be exposed to, and how do you sort of integrate that into the decision making. um, uh, I think going forward for all the financial, be it P funds, be it the banks, etc., it will be important, it will be critical for you to sort of evaluate what the climate risks are, what is the potential threat of those climate risks to your business, how do you factor it into your decision making, and what's the short term and the long term sort of corrective action you need to take. Just for everybody's benefit, for the audience's benefit, climate risks are essentially split in two parts. One are the physical risk, which means if you have floods, if you have winds, if you have cyclone or these kind of natural disasters that are there, and if that forms a threat to your asset, then those are the physical risks which we need to take into consideration. And the second one are the transition risks, because your markets will change because of the climate related issues. There will be different regulatory or legal frameworks that will develop in different parts of the world, in different geographies, and how your business is sort of positioned to address that. Litigation risks, for example, or reputational risks that will come because of that. Has your business taken account of some of these issues, and how are you positioned to address these issues? I think going forward that will become extremely important. A lot of the businesses, a lot of the banks have started doing it in bits and pieces, but I think this will gain a lot of momentum. Disclosure as part of TCFD, disclosure or the requirement of disclosure for all the financial institutions to say how you have factored in climate risk in your decision making will start becoming very, very important. In fact, almost imperative. I mean, I don't think we can get away from that.
Before that, I think you're absolutely correct when you say it's a new world we live in. With that, I'd like to jump over to Sumit. And Sumit, your thoughts on the governance risk and the diligence component, and of course on the tracking mechanisms.
Yeah, it's GF and Goldman. When I was at Goldman, we worked together on Renew, and I know how close our philosophies were. And it's no different as when I moved over to Actus, where as I said, ESG is not something different. It's very integrated into our overall value system. I'll not repeat what Rakhi mentioned. I think a lot of what she said is what we follow. As she said, the standards are slightly different, but our head of sustainability, she also comes from similar kind of backgrounds. We work very closely with ERM, where Rakhi came from. So I can see how, I can see like now can join those threads and see why what she said is so, it resonates a lot with me. Now, only few things to add here is for us from a fund governance standpoint, right? We have a partner and head of sustainability who is part of our executive committee, right? Which is a team of, let's say, 6-7 leaders of the firm. And she's part of that, which effectively means that she's at the table for all sorts of decision making, whether it's strategy, whether it's deployment, whether it's exit. So ESG becomes a very important question across all of those, and she sits kind of at that level. As far as what Rakhi mentioned in terms of the type of work that we do, obviously it's very similar. There's obviously that G element of it, which is the governance and integrity element of it, and the ENS element of it, which clearly are different skill sets, right? So, for example, we would engage someone like an ERM, right, to do a ENS study for us, versus the G study will be done by some of the usual, integrity consultants. And the ENS piece, the intensity of that varies depending on whether you're doing a hydro project, whether you're doing a renewable project, wind project, or solar project, or for that matter a gas project, right? So the intensity of that is very different. Now I'm working on multiple road assets, and I see a very different sort of intensity for ESG, where we are being asked questions on, hey, how do you think you'll impact sustainability when you're doing road projects, right? Because the usual aspects of what we think of green, where you're doing wind and solar, obviously you're saying I'm changing the overall environmental aspect of it, may or may not be directly involved in a road project. But then, as Rakhi mentioned, the broader aspects of SDG goals, right? Like, are we hitting some of those broader goals of SDG just beyond climate? You'll realize that the impact is massive when you're doing, for example, road projects where you're kind of going kilometers after kilometers and changing lives of community across those, right? So they're very different aspects of it. What I'll say is, on our ICs, ESG is probably the first thing that we discuss, right? And the way we approach it, as Rakhi also mentioned, is, while there are obviously threshold questions on whether we do certain deals or not based on this ESG sustainability aspect, but the way we look at life is how can we improve ESG and sustainability in each of these assets, right? And the reality is that there are so many low-hanging fruits for us, that we always find an ability to improve. And we have developed our own frameworks, which we can come to later. But there is a very tangible way of measuring, some of these improvements that we can do. From a governance standpoint, again, as Rakhi mentioned, I think there are no ongoing governance as such. There are some obviously reps and warranties that we would take on the integrity aspects. Now, the fact of the matter is there also the standards are very different. You can have US standards, European standards, which are very, very stringent versus what you have in India sometimes, right? And then sometimes some of those things don't align. And that's where we have a debate and discussion and arrive at a landing. As far as ongoing is concerned, I don't think there are covenants, but obviously firms like GF, Actus, all of us will have very strong sustainability committees in each of these entities, right? On a portfolio, when we kind of dive into the portfolio, and we will have like metrics which are then well integrated into our annual operating plans and business plans, which will then, right, drive the performance not just of the business, but will also be linked to incentives that we pay to our senior leadership and management teams, right? So it's all, it cascades from the top to the portfolio team, which then kind of helps in not just planning, but also implementing some of these standards. The only last thing I'd say is from an Actus standpoint, I think we have now done a full carbon portfolio mapping for which we completed in Q1 of this year, right? And we have kind of committed to a net zero targets in 2050, right? And we are now in the process of coming up with a shorter kind of milestones for 2030. Once we've done that, I think that will kind of cascade across all our portfolio companies, right? And what we kind of need to do. So, so that's the way, we are kind of managing the overall ESG piece with portfolio companies.
And Sahil, maybe just to add to what Sumit said, right, and which you also mentioned. So ESG essentially is a journey because, like you rightly said, not all companies perhaps are at the maturity level that we expect them to. They are not. And it's going to take time. The idea is not to expect everything to evolve or change within a year. It's not possible. It's not just possible. But how do you sort of equip them to be able to implement all of this? I think from a fund level, from an investor point of view, I think that becomes very, very important. How do you enable them? What kind of resources do you bring to the table? What kind of expertise do you bring to the table? And how do you let them move from not suddenly from a 2 to 8 in one go, but 2 to 4 and 4 to 6 and 6 to 8. I think that's essentially is where it will have a long-term impact. And the idea is, as an investor, once we go in, the ESG journey should not start and end with us. It should continue even after our exit. And that takes time, it takes commitment, and it happens slow and steady.
The one thing is that climate change unites us. And what is particularly endearing over here is how both of you are speaking in the same voice on this journey. And that is something we all look forward to. I think that's been fantastic so far. Now, sorry, Ratnadeep, did you have something to say?
No, I think I'm done unless there's something specific.
I think Ratnadeep had something.
I just wanted to follow up on, the very, as Sahil said, it's heartening to see the sort of ethos and approach both these organizations and others like you have. I just wanted to understand, are you seeing a similar or a higher standard being expected of you by your LPs in your LPAs? Are there measurable metrics that they are expecting you to sort of periodically update them on or demonstrate to them on ESG or climate sustainability goals?
So maybe I can take that first. So Ratnadeep, definitely, I think as the understanding of ESG, sustainability, and climate change is evolving across the world, I think so are the requirements and expectations also. What I used to disclose or what I used to kind of monitor and measure 5 years back will no longer hold true. There will always be an expectation that we'll do much more bigger and larger than what it was 5 years back. And again, going forward, I think an example of TCFD and how do we need to start measuring metrics around the entire climate change. Supply chain is again a critical area that we have to start looking at very critically, because that's going to be again very, very important, especially in the whole evolving geopolitical context, etc. Some sectors may be more dependent on a particular geography than others. So how do you sort of diversify the supply chain? Any human right related issues around supply chain, measuring, monitoring, and reporting on those aspects. I think all of that is becoming more and more, I would say, not onerous, but it's becoming imperative. It's necessary for everyone in the value chain to kind of consider those aspects. So the scope of diligence, the scope of ESG, the scope of how you measure your impacts will also definitely sort of widen. We recently also became a signatory to something called as the IFC Operating Principles for Impact, which basically provides a broad framework in terms of how, as a fund, along with your portfolio companies, need to start measuring impacts. At GF internally, we have certain metrics defined, and because we are a resource efficiency fund, there is an expectation in terms of, let's say, how do I monitor and measure, let's say, my water footprint or energy, how is my energy optimization or wastewater reduction, for example, or materials, depending upon what mandate I have invested in. So these are some of the areas that depending upon what sector, what mandate I have, needs to be reported. Apart from that, I think specifically speaking on the climate related issues, measurement on scope 1, scope 2 emissions is very, very important. I think we have started doing that with our portfolio companies in terms of that measurement. And increasingly, I think if we have to start talking about the net zero goals, the scope 3 emissions, and maybe for those perhaps who are not familiar to what scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 is. So scope 1 emissions are those emissions which come in from the direct use of the power at your site. So for example, DG sets, cogen plants, which you have within your premises, and you are generating power, that becomes your scope 1. Your scope 2 is your borrowed power. So anything that comes from the grid, and therefore the energy consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions because of that consumptions become your scope 2. And scope 3 is anything outside the boundaries. So your transportation, your logistics, in your value chain, your supply chain, everything becomes part of scope 3 emissions. And if you have to attain and achieve net zero goals, it's not just measurement of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that will be important, but scope 3 emissions will increasingly start becoming very, very important, without which I think it will be very hard to say if we are attaining net zero or not.
Yeah, I completely agree with Rakhi. I could not have put it more eloquently. But the reality is that, the answer to your question is absolutely yes, that LPs are concerned, bothered. And as I was mentioning, one transaction that I'm doing, the question that was asked of me is, can you comment on how would your investment address scope 3 emissions? And Rakhi helpfully, defined scope 3. And scope 3 is probably one of the toughest to kind of define, right? And especially on a road transaction, to define scope 3 emissions, right, is not very easy, right? So I'm just saying that LPs are actually going to that level of depth and saying, now we've heard a lot of stories, now please demonstrate how do you actually measure that, right? Now, the flip side of that argument is if you are able to measure that, right? So, funds like, ourselves, who are really serious about it, it's not just raising funds, but it's integrated into the core philosophy of our firm. There are benefits of that because LPs trust you. You actually get capital, and they partner with you through that journey, not just and across the world, right? Because these are very, very large LPs that we're talking about. So there are two sides to the coin. They're getting more nuanced, and these things are getting more nuanced. It's not just at the headline level that we care about climate. But yeah, these are conversations that are happening real time with our investors.
Are you seeing any other impact in terms of return or time expectations across all your stakeholders?
No, as I mentioned, Sahil, before as well, that we don't think of us as ESG funds versus other funds, right? For us, ESG and climate has always been part of our core philosophy, and hence when we have looked at returns, which I think Rakhi also mentioned, it is just one element in that overall puzzle, right? And we personally think it positively contributes to our returns, right? It doesn't take away our returns, but it actually positively contributes to our returns. And at least whatever little experience we've had in India, right, we have built two very large platforms on the energy side, and for all it's worth, they were some of the more attractive investments that we've made in the energy space, right? And both of those were green investments that we made. You could argue that there was a cost of doing that, and so on and so forth. But the fact is, government gave us scale through this entire renewable energy program and plan, which helped us build scale sooner, right? And if you think of our exits as well, as I mentioned, there was a huge premium which was attached to you not just doing green, but doing green in the right framework, right, of sustainability. And I think that kind of clearly distinguished our platform versus some of the other platforms, right, that are out there. So I don't, personally, I don't think there is an additional cost, and we'll have to chip off returns because we're doing green. But I at least fundamentally, we believe that that's core part of everything that we'll do, and what we have done historically as well, since Actus came into existence. And we don't distinguish that. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, there are funds, large brethren of ours who are establishing climate funds and other funds. For them, probably the way they look at returns could be slightly different for each of these funds.
And maybe, Sahil, just to sort of add a slightly different perspective here, right? I mean, when we look at returns and stuff like that, I think it needs to be also looked at it from a portfolio company level, that when you sort of look at doing the right thing or doing ESG or looking at specific kind of products, etc., are we getting a sort of an edge over the competition? Are we getting sort of entry into specific geographies because you are considered to be much more doing the right thing or more climate friendly things as compared to some of the other competitor or other companies maybe. And I think that's an upside which will obviously kind of get rolled up into at the fund level, at an investor level. So it's also in terms of access to capital. Are your portfolio companies able to access better capital because you have sort of rolled out some of these requirements at a fund level? So I think when you look at returns perspective, I think it's not just returns in terms of at an exit, what is the upside to the valuation that you're getting, but also in terms of your portfolio companies performing better as compared to their peers because they have put in and rolled out all of these processes and systems. I think, yeah.
So I think both of you have touched upon my next question in some form or the other, but I'll just highlight it, and then if you have any tidbits to add, we can always supplement your previous answers. I wanted to talk a little bit about the framework that Actus and GEF have made towards measuring the positive impact of investing. If you'd like to highlight some of the frameworks.
So Sahil, again, maybe I think I've slightly touched upon this question when I spoke about, we signing up to IFC operating principles for impact. We having internal measurement metrics around energy, water, wastewater. We looking at a lot of the social development indicators in terms of quality of employment, number of jobs, gender diversity. Today everyone is talking about the whole 2x challenge, wherein we talk about, gender diversity and climate, how they are getting closely integrated, because women are going to be the sort of number one enablers towards climate change, and also they are sort of they will also be the most affected by climate change. So I think gender diversity and climate change again is being spoken about very voraciously in the investor community. That's going to be very, very critical. What kind of how communities are getting positively impacted through the investments that we have made, through the businesses that we have invested in. These are some of the impact, both the social development and the climate indicators that we have been sort of monitoring and measuring. It's also important that once we measure and monitor this, what is the sort of year-on-year improvement that we are trying to seek, and how do we sort of make that change happen over a period of time, to have internal goals set for that. So these are some of the areas and these are some of the frameworks that we have been using, again to monitor and measure certain specific social indicators. There are frameworks like something called as the IRIS, there is something called as CIRIS. Many more are coming up as well. So I think funds can use different tools and frameworks to kind of see what best fits their mandate, their requirement to measure and monitor impacts. But I think that's again a very important part of what GEF does as well.
So from an Actus standpoint, I'll be quick. So we have a framework called, I'm sure we have a lot, but a framework called the Actus Impact Score. What it does is it's a indigenous kind of framework that we have prepared based on obviously several other standards that we have. It has two fundamental things. It forecasts a score at exit as to what that score would look like once we've invested in a company. The other thing that it also throws up is a multiple, right? So which is an indicator of what have we done to improve the score once we have acquired a company. So for example, if you were to acquire a green business, right, obviously the score would be high because it's a green business. But then what we get measured on, right, is, what is a multiple that we will achieve over a period of time. So, for example, if you've, let's say it's a multiple is 1.5, so we've basically improved it, right, over a period of time, right. So that's a very measurable, framework that we have. And what it does is it aligns us with the broader SDG goals, because all of those are integrated. So if I were to put together an investment committee paper, I would have like a section which will be prepared by a sustainability team, which focuses on this AIS, and that will be discussed in terms of what SDG goals we are actually addressing, and hence what is the current score and what is the multiple. And that goes back to my previous point that it also helps us, not just tell stories, but at the end of the day, actually give a actual number, right, to our LPs. And this then gets reported, I think, pretty much on a quarterly basis to our LP community, right? So that's kind of a very tangible framework that we have developed for ourselves.
Thank you. The next question, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the laws on governance, especially the European and the US laws that are usually taken into account by PE funds in their investing activities in India. Ratnadeep, would you like to throw some light on what you have seen in this space?
I think, number of the US statutes are long arm, especially in the context of, anti-corruption, in the context of sanctions, in the context of money laundering. So for all these three specific heads, you would need to ensure, and the private equity funds themselves need to ensure that portfolio companies, especially where they are in a controlling position, are able to demonstrate compliance, are able to demonstrate a requirement that these laws are being complied with. So that's something that we've seen, find there's ways into investment agreements, investment documentation, sometimes even in terms of periodic reporting. So I would say these are the laws which are often the areas of focus. Additionally, not so much from an ESG perspective, but from a taxation perspective, again, there are certain compliances that are required. I would say, again, primarily from a US law perspective, but also from certain European jurisdictions. Those are also compliances that find their way into documentation. I think the key thing is it becomes mainly a function of whether or not the funds are in a controlling position with the portfolio companies, because then the standard really sort of becomes high. And that's what we've seen. Of course, as Sumit and others mentioned before, there is sometimes non-alignment between what are the standards under these US and European laws versus what is seen in India, and what maybe the operating teams are used to implementing, what the promoters in Indian context are used to being are comfortable with. So that is a sort of a learning experience for many companies in the Indian context. But by and large, we've seen investee companies being cognizant of the fact that these are standards that they will need to adopt and that they will need to modify. But yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question.
I think it does. Thank you. It throws a lot of light on it. I am conscious that we're almost out of time. We have two questions to deal with. But before we jump into that, I have one final question for Rakhi. Any thoughts on emerging regulatory trends or litigation risk?
Yeah, Sahil. So I think, in terms of, if you look at our country, I think in terms of environmental laws, health and safety, social laws, I think we have a plethora of laws. They have been around for a very, very long time. I don't need to say that over here. But I think with recently India committing to 2070 net zero, what kind of strategies, what kind of policies, what kind of regulatory frameworks may come in so that businesses, communities, cities, all of us together are able to kind of reach up to that goal. Likely that will come in, may come in. I think that's a possibility. Um, uh, uh, in 2015, I think when we signed up to the Paris Agreement, there were a lot of mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies that Government of India came about, but they have been slightly broader. Maybe there will be some more nuance that might come in, quite likely. Disclosures in companies, disclosures across various institutions will start becoming more and more prominent in terms of how you do your climate disclosures, how do you do your ESG disclosures. I think right now in India, we have the BRSR reporting for the top 1,000 listed companies, but I think more and more stringent disclosure requirements will perhaps start coming in. I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, but RBI came up, they had their own sustainable kind of group that they had formulated in terms of how banks need to start looking at climate related risk as part of the investment. So I see some movement happening there in terms of the lending, in terms of the banks kind of embracing these kind of challenges. And therefore, I think uh, uh, my sense is shareholder activism, consumer activism will start becoming more and more prominent, where there will be larger accountability on businesses to kind of report and talk about these issues, not just superficially in a form of a sustainability report or annual report, but much more deeper in terms of the kind of impact they are having or not having, for that matter. um, the whole challenge or the whole movement around e-mobility will throw up challenges in terms of lithium ion recycling, for example. How do you do that? Because mining of lithium, again, etc., has its own ESG challenges, and sourcing it, the whole supply chain issues that we spoke about. I think those will start, taking center stage. Solar panels. I mean, if you're looking at moving towards renewable energy, and most of our India's energy is going to come through solar power, then what do you do with end of life solar panels, solar cells? Do we have the right infrastructure, policies, processes to kind of develop that? And again, those are also opportunities for investment in climate change, because you will need these kind of high tech facilities. And how do you sort of mobilize all of that in across the country? I think some of these will become, I think, our contamination risk and other litigation risk, which we have been traditionally known, will be there, but it will sort of also expand. I think obviously with these kind of things thrown up, you will obviously have to be a lot more mindful about how you do your business. I think that would be sort of my thoughts on that.
I think that was very, very forward-thinking. We are in for interesting times. I think we are out of time. We have two questions from Rashmi and Manisha. I'd like to invite you into the coffee corner where we can sit and discuss your thoughts. Arvindji, over to you.
Thank you. It was fascinating, this discussion, and everybody would love to hear the talk by everybody. Rakhi, Sumit, and everybody in this meeting. So thanks a ton to everybody and to our honored guest speakers. We will now transition into the coffee corner.